What is avoidant personality disorder? What's up guys, Matty B here and welcome to No Going Back. Today I'm going to talk about avoidant personality disorder, what it is, how I got it, and how I'm managing it. But before we go any further, make sure to like and subscribe and make sure to turn on bell notifications so you can be notified every time we release a new video. Now, some of you may be familiar with personality disorders, particularly if you've watched enough reality TV. With personality disorders, you have three types or clusters. Cluster A, paranoid, schizoid, or schizotypal. Cluster A are our psychosomatic disorders, which includes things like paranoid and schizoid. These are also called the odd or eccentric cluster. Cluster B, antisocial, borderline, narcissist, histrionic. Cluster B has the disorders you've probably already heard of. These are the disorders where people struggle to regulate themselves emotionally. These are characterized by being dramatic, overly emotional, or having unpredictable thinking or behavior. Now, if you've watched Married at First Sight, you may even have some theories about who fits what criteria in Cluster B, but I'll tell you right now, I'm not going to touch that with a barge pole. Instead, we're going to focus on Cluster C, the anxiety disorders. Cluster C, avoidant, dependent, obsessive compulsive. Now, compared to the other clusters, there's actually not a whole lot of research around some of these disorders. You've probably heard of obsessive compulsive disorder or OCD. You might have heard of dependent or avoidant. But when I was diagnosed with avoidant personality disorder, I wasn't very familiar with it. I mean, I've always known I was an anxious person, but I'm still a bit surprised when people find behaviors that I consider normal kind of interesting. So what is avoidant personality disorder? Well, first, let's talk about what it isn't, because when my series of maths aired, I had a lot of keyboard experts giving me their armchair diagnosis. Some people took it upon themselves to sound off on social media about how they thought I was autistic, which is actually a surprisingly common mistake to make. Often people who are diagnosed with avoidant personality disorder are also tested for autism and Asperger's because of some of the overlapping emotional and social symptoms. For instance, people with autism and Asperger's often struggle to read social cues. Whereas for those like myself with avoidant personality disorder, it's actually the opposite. Put me in a stressful or threatening situation and I am hypersensitive to other people and their social cues. I will often overanalyze how they're thinking, how they're feeling, how they're reacting to me and try to predict what they're going to do next. Unfortunately, this hypervigilant often leads to catastrophizing and projecting scenarios and threats that just aren't there. To put it simply, avoidant personality disorder is extreme anxiety induced by stressful situations. I liken it to escaping from social and relational discomfort at all costs. And when you can't physically get away, you mentally check out. Now, if you saw my season of maths and the video I did on what really went on behind the scenes, you can understand the anxiety I was experiencing. I was constantly placed in triggering situations where I became flooded with anxiety and paralyzed with fear. Add in a shit edit and yeah, it might look like I'm struggling to read social cues, but it's because I'm essentially trapped in a situation that I can't physically get out of. So I checked out emotionally. The second thing AVPD gets confused with is avoidant attachment. These are the people who get into relationships and then withdraw when confronted with intimacy. They usually blow hot and cold, whereas avoidants actually avoid closeness and relationships altogether. We're absolutely terrified of rejection, so in order to not get hurt, we don't let anyone past our armor. We prefer to just skip the drama. So how do you get avoidant personality disorder? Now, there doesn't seem to be much consensus about whether personality disorders are something you're born with or you learn. The lines get even blurrier between the different clusters or types. My personal opinion is that avoidant personality disorder is something that I learned. It's a coping mechanism I developed in childhood to deal with extreme anxiety. Don't get me wrong, I love my family, but growing up, I was always made aware that what other people thought of me was really important. Status, external validation, and approval of others was the metric by which all value and worth was measured. On top of this, I have a sibling who has a very disordered pattern of behavior, and growing up had to be kept happy at all costs. What this meant for me was that I spent so much time trying to keep everyone around me happy that I never really had the opportunity to figure out who I was or what I wanted. My value was purely determined by how useful I was to others. If you've ever been in the situation where you've cared too much about what other people think of you, you'll know it's really stressful and a miserable place to be. When I was at my worst, it was like that, only on steroids. I spent most of my 20s isolated. I never had a relationship and had very few close friends. And it wasn't because I didn't want those things, I really did. But I was so terrified of rejection that I couldn't put myself out there. I had zero self-esteem and I was horribly depressed. The only thing that gave me any sort of enjoyment was working out. And even then I was motivated to be big and strong so no one would mess with me. Basically, an external shield or armor I could hide behind. Eventually, I just became more and more depressed. And something had to give, so I started working on putting myself out there and doing things that terrified me. Unlike some of the other personality disorders, avoidant is treatable. Jumping into recovery. My recovery didn't start with going on reality TV. That's something I had to build myself up to doing. For me, the journey started with reading self-help books and books on emotional intelligence. I also tried hypnotherapy and age regression therapy. But the biggest thing for me was deliberately forcing myself into situations that terrified me. I actually went bungee jumping in New Zealand, which was a pants-shitting experience that I ended up loving. It was the first instance of me realizing that the things that scared me the most gave me the greatest fulfillment when I faced them. It created this positive feedback loop where eventually I realized that those feelings of terror could lead to something positive. A lot of people think that going on maths was a big shift for me, especially when they compare me now to how I was back then on TV. And yeah, I did learn a lot from the experience, but it was the furthest thing from a magic bullet. In actuality, in just the 10 days I was on the experiment, I felt myself regressing and getting worse again, and I knew I had to get out of there as quickly as I could. In the 2 years that followed after the show, my recovery has really accelerated, and I owe that to a number of things. One thing that research says greatly improves the chance of recovery from avoidant personality disorder is being supported by loved ones. Even though my experience on the show was quite damaging, I was lucky enough to meet someone a couple of months later and get into my first ever relationship, which has been both terrifying and the best thing that has ever happened to me. My partner has encouraged me to start schema and cognitive behavioral therapy, which is built on the foundations and has taught me to sit with my emotions and try to understand them, instead of hiding from them. The beauty of avoidant personality disorder being a learnt behavior means that it can be unlearnt. It doesn't have to be permanent. This realization for me was light at the end of the tunnel. I had for so long believed that I was the way I was and was stuck that way, and there was nowhere to change it. But through cognitive behavioral therapy and talking through my emotions with my partner, the change has been quite rapid. There's so much I want to touch on what's helping me to reprogram myself to no longer rely on the unnecessary shield that is AVPD, but it's such a big topic that I feel it deserves its own video. But I want to leave you with the idea that healing avoidant personality disorder is basically about reteaching yourself to feel the emotions that come up without numbing them. However, I will go into more detail on this strategy in a later video. If you guys found this video helpful, make sure to like it and go ahead and hit the subscribe button and make sure to turn on bell notifications so you can be notified every time we release a new video. Thanks so much for watching everyone, and until next time, I'm Matty B, and be kind to one another.